Wendy is to deliver the next interesting lecture. Wendy is Director of Project Delivery with ICON. And that means that Wendy is responsible for a number of strategic clients and a number of global programs to oversee the programs and let's say, the delivery of that. Wendy joined ICON 15 years ago, has also been functioning as a data manager and project manager. Meanwhile, very experienced for the CRO perspective, and that's exactly what she will cover today, the CRO perspective of clinical trials during the pandemic. Wendy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ronald. Okay, so let me get my slides in front of me. So as Ronald mentioned, I will focus on the CRO perspective on trial management of multi-site phase 1 trials and during the COVID-19 outbreak. Yes, so it all works. So let's see what I will be discussing today. I'll start with an overview of the COVID-19 landscape for management of phase 1 trials and the global challenges that we were facing. Following this global overview, I'll be discussing a case study, focusing on the impact on the study design, impact on timelines, and impact on monitor strategy. I'll explain our challenges and how we managed these during the pandemic. To keep oversight and document everything that happened during our trials, we updated several trial documents and created new tools and documents, which I will discuss as well. And finally, I will summarize the lessons learned. So to manage phase 1 trials during a pandemic, we first need to understand all contributors that are involved. So obviously, of course, the sponsor. The sponsor had to determine their strategy towards study conduct and towards their development program, decide if a study should be put on hold or if it can continue and how that would have impact on their program. Besides the sponsor, of course, we have the sites, and they had to find a way to continue recruitment, to continue study conduct. For some countries and sites, study conduct was put on hold due to unavailability of immediate care, for example, like in the Netherlands, or because hospitals required physicians and nurses to focus on COVID care. Sites also needed to take into account the requirements from local government, like lockdowns, local regulatory guidances, etc. And of course, as mentioned in the previous presentation, we also needed to take into account the EMA and FDA guidances that they released. From a CRO perspective, it's our aim to connect all of these contributors to make sure there's alignment, how to move forward with a clinical trial during such a situation as COVID-19. If we look from a helicopter and look at the biggest challenges that we faced, these were related, of course, related to safety impact, a lot of uncertainty about the COVID-19 virus, how this would develop, how this would impact subject health in combination with study compounds, etc. Recruitment, subjects had difficulties to travel, difficulties to come to the sites, had to quarantine at home due to infection or exposure. We've seen impact on staff availability, specifically also at sites and at our labs. Staff had to stay home due to infections or waiting for test results, etc. So that impacted our work. Access to sites impacted monitoring, very important that could continue. So we had to develop ways to do that. Challenging was the differences in local regulations, as just discussed as well, and especially for multi-site trials, combining these regulations, overseeing the whole trial, made it complicated. And last but not least, the many logistical challenges that we faced, sample shipments, IMP shipments, because the courier infrastructures were impacted, and also availability of supplies due to closure of several factories, for example, in Asia. So let's continue with the case study I would like to present today. So the case study I'll be discussing is a biosimilar study with an immunosuppressant compound. At the time the pandemic started, we included approximately 150 of 360 subjects that we would need at that time. It was a multi-center, multi-control trial with sites in both US and EU. We started the study with 3 sites, and When the study was completed, during the pandemic, we had 6 sites. Mid-March, the study was, in 2020, of course, the study was put on hold. This was a joint decision between the sponsor and CRO team, mainly because of the safety risks or unknown safety risks for the subject, specifically because of the nature of this compound being an immunosuppressant. Okay, one of the main challenges in this case study for us was related to the fact that multiple countries and multiple sites across EU and US were involved. Therefore, we had to understand and align all requirements for study conduct and think about COVID testing, travel restrictions, quarantine requirements, etc. With the main objective of the study that it's a biosimilar, or to prove biosimilarity, it's very important to determine the best approach and design for the study that would work at all sites and countries. So several risks were identified, several solutions we came up with. So first of all, we needed to avoid the risk to include COVID-19 infected subjects. This was applicable for all trials, obviously, but in particular for this immunosuppressant trial. For the case study, we required COVID-19 testing at day -3 and day -1, so twice. For all other trials, we required a single COVID-19 testing pre-dose. With this duplicate testing, we wanted to reduce the risk as much as possible to include and dose infected subjects. There's also a risk to be infected after dosing, especially when subjects leave the clinic and go home and travel again. Therefore, we extended the in-house period and added a home quarantine period for 1 week after discharge. We were also facing or seeing safety risks for COVID-19 infections if subjects, or we wanted to reduce the risks for COVID-19 infection for subjects, so therefore we reduced the upper age limit in our study. And finally, we also added temperature and oxygen saturation measurements at all vital sign time points for our study. Another challenge we faced was how to minimize impact on study timelines and enrollment. COVID-19 impacted recruitment differently across sites. Some sites there was no impact, some sites there was recruitment was even improved, for example, due to an increase in unemployment rate, so more people available to join clinical trials. But for the majority of sites, we have seen an effect in recruitment because of the pandemic, due to travel restrictions, sometimes due to fear to travel to a clinic to get infected, and also because universities were closed and students would not return to their campus close to a phase 1 unit, for example. Besides the impact of recruitment on the timelines, the study hold also contributed to the delay we faced. And to minimize this delay as much as possible, we decided together with the client, with the sponsor, to add 3 sites to the study. And that brought the total of the study to 6 sites. If we present that in a total timeline, then we can see the study hold in March 2020, screening enrollment put on hold. From April to June, we worked together with the sponsor and with the sites to work on an approach on how to restart, not only from a safety perspective, but also to make sure all regulatory requirements are taken into account for all sites and all countries. In July 2020, we started to submit the submitted protocol and documents to the ethics committee, and we got our first approvals in August to restart enrollment. The 360 subjects we initially needed for the study were all enrolled by November, which means that the total delay because of COVID was 5 months for enrollment of these 360 subjects. This was reduced, so this includes the addition of 3 sites, which speeds up our enrollment for this study. So it would have been much longer otherwise. As last item to the case study, I would like to discuss the impact on monitoring and the challenges we had. To understand how we could continue monitoring during the pandemic, we first had to identify local requirements for visiting sites. and develop a site-specific approach for each separate site. In addition, the CRAs had regular contact with the sites to understand any changes in the site visit requirements or in the local situation during the pandemic. We also worked on developing new ways to complete site monitoring, like remote monitoring. We have a COVID-19 task force within our company that supports and advises in any COVID-19 related matters, but also with regards to monitoring. And they provided a guidance for us related to remote monitoring. And basically our key position is that it's not allowed to do any source data remote monitoring outside of the clinic. And we would be able to do remote monitoring through electronic medical records, but we cannot accept source documents to be sent into ICON. In very rare circumstances, if there is any urgency for database lock, there might be a possibility to do some remote monitoring through WebEx. For this case study, actually, we had locally based CRAs, and therefore monitoring could continue at all sites. So we did not have to use any remote monitoring. We did not have to do any remote visits. So that was great news, and that really avoided any delays in monitoring for this study. To minimize the risk on monitoring delays due to COVID-19 infection of the CRA or a quarantine of the CRA because of any exposure to COVID, we also monitor the progress very closely and would train any backup CRAs if needed. To be able to evaluate the impact of COVID-19 on protocol deviations, we had created or have created a separate label in our CTMS system. So any protocol deviations related to COVID-19 would get this label. And with that, we can extract all those deviations specifically related to COVID-19 and understand the impact of COVID-19 on that study related to study conduct and quality. So that's very helpful to look back and to evaluate. In all of the examples I explained above, the key message would be communication. It's very important to make sure there's alignment between sponsor, site, and CRO, especially in these uncertain circumstances, and jointly make decisions on how to move forward. For multi-phase 1 trials, we always assign a lead project manager and several other lead roles as well to oversee the conduct of the trial. The lead PM coordinates with the team and sites to assign lead roles, for example, the lead PI, a lead study manager for the sites, and a lead CTM. So there's one lead PI in contact with all PIs from the sites to have discussions, for example. We have weekly meetings with all PIs and study managers, including these lead roles, to have open discussions to discuss impact of pandemic at each of the sites, share experiences, and ensure consistency within the trial. This communication structure worked very well for us during the pandemic. It works for us at all multi-site trials, but during this pandemic, this really was a plus to have this structure already set up. Okay, for managing risks and documenting everything that happened, we updated some of the documents we use and also created some new tools to make sure we properly document everything and can keep oversight. So first of all, we have updated our project management risk log that we prepare for all trials. We have included general COVID-19 risks that we identified as an early phase department. So those had to be included in all studies. In addition, teams would include study-specific risks related to COVID-19 as well. We had a lot of company-wide discussions also to make sure we include every risk that we could think of basically related to COVID-19 and make sure we could mitigate those. A medical risk assessment and mitigation is always prepared as well by the lead PI for each of the studies. This risk assessment was updated to include COVID-19 related risk mitigation. This specific risk mitigation is also part of our protocols, as well as this has also been requested by ethics committees and regulatory authorities. And then last, to keep oversight of the COVID status at each of the sites and to identify any risks. We have prepared COVID questionnaires and trackers for the sites. Each of the sites are requested by the clinical trial manager to complete these questionnaires and answer questions about the COVID status in their area, impact on study conduct, requirement for monitoring visits, etc. And by having these questionnaires completed regularly, it's easier to keep oversight on the status at each of the sites. Besides risk assessments, we also felt as an early phase department, it's important to document everything that happened during a study related to COVID-19. So this is an ongoing process. We're still using storyboards to do that. These storyboards are internal documents and prepared for each of the trials. So there's a separate storyboard for each trial. And in that storyboard, we include each project response related to COVID-19 crisis management. It's our intent to capture the whole story, include all references to COVID-19 related study documents, so that at any time, whether for an inspection or an audit or any historical references, we can reconstruct our COVID-19 approach and learn from that and evaluate that as well. Some examples for questions that are in there for the team is if there are any issues impacting the IP, if there are any changes to database or data management, any regulatory implications for this specific study, any vendor disruptions expected, everything, all those questions are in this template as a guidance for the team to complete. It's a living document. As long as the study is ongoing, this document will be updated, and therefore it also helps the team to evaluate all aspects of the trial during COVID-19. Okay, let me see. Yeah, I would like to end my presentation with summarizing the lessons learned, basically a summary of what I've discussed. So first of all, it's very important to do this thorough risk analysis, obviously with all risks that we foreseen. For this pandemic, unfortunately, we could not have foreseen that this would happen. So it's very important that as soon as we come in such an unexpected situation, to have these tools available and to immediately start doing this risk assessment as much as possible. The pandemic also resulted in more flexibility to manage and monitor a study remotely. We are now more used to work remotely and also have processes in place to partly monitor studies or do study visits remotely. The storyboard we created has been a huge help to be able to recall everything that happened and have a good overview of all related documentation. It will help us also for future situations like this. Very important for multi-site trials is to have a clear communication structure, connecting sponsors, CRO and sites. During this pandemic, this has even been more important. From a CRO perspective, it really helped that we worked with our lead roles and have these regular meetings with the whole teams. And then last but not least, our biggest lessons learned is the confirmation that we can manage, even in such a unique, challenging situations, together with sponsors, sites and vendors, we together have showed that we can continue to manage successfully and complete clinical trials in this situation. So that was my last slide. Thank you all. And please provide your messages in the chat and then can discuss later on.
Thank you, Wendy, for your perspective on the CRO side of things. I'm sure we will have an interesting discussion about the CRO perspective, but we will combine that after the two next lectures about the sponsor's perspective and the phase 1 unit perspective.